I played a blitz game on Lichess. I was white. Began with d4, and we played the semi-Slav defense. And in this position, I went for a very aggressive move, bishop to g5. Sometimes I play it a little quieter, more positionally with e3, keeping my bishop inside the pawn chain. Play could continue, for example, like this. It's a more modest way to play. White usually gets a slight space advantage, and black's a little bit cramped but solid. But I got my bishop outside of the pawn chain, bishop to g5, and there are few moves black can make here. He made the sharpest move of all, captured on c4. Other ways to play that are a little quieter include h6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6 is a positional game. Another way black could have played here was knight b d7, e3, and then queen a5. And this transposes into the Cambridge Springs variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. And black's pinning that knight on c3. And he's also eyeing that bishop across the board if this pawn ever moves. It's a very interesting opening. I recommend looking at it. I like to play it as black. But my opponent went for the very sharp d takes c4. It's worth noting that masters used to think that this move was just an outright mistake because of the response e4. So black has given up control of the center. And white not only gets this move e4 in, but he also gets this threat of e5 attacking the pinned knight. Okay, but now it's actually established that this is a fine way for black to play. It's very double-edged, and he can get away with it. So black now protected his pawn on c4, so he solidifies his pawn advantage, but he allows me to attack the pinned knight on f6. So the way black gets out of this so as not to lose a piece, and the only way to get out of it, is to attack my bishop on g5. Okay, and here it's best to retreat the bishop. It's actually in black's favor to trade these minor pieces like this. So I retreated the bishop, and black has to continue with g5 to cut the bishop off here. And at this stage, the correct move is knight takes g5, sacking the knight for a couple pawns because you still have this pin on the f6 knight, and you can regain your piece at any time. So if you take stock of the position here, white is up one pawn. Well, he's down a piece, but he's going to gain it back. Okay, so my opponent played knight b d7, and I'm going to fianchetto this bishop here, hitting that weak pawn on c6. Typically, black's plans include bishop to b7, queen to b6, and then castling long. So I want my bishop pointed in this direction. So I get ready to fianchetto. My opponent protects that long diagonal with bishop b7. I complete the fianchetto. And now my opponent moves his queen, releasing the pin on his knight. But he puts it on an unusual square. I've never seen this move queen a5 in this position. More typically, black will move it to b6. I don't know the theory a lot in this opening, but I suspect a couple reasons for queen b6 are it lends support to the bishop on b7 in case this pawn wants to move, and then that bishop wouldn't be unsupported. But also that queen is hitting this d4 pawn, which is backward or going to be isolated in a minute. And if we castle long here, then the rook would be hitting that as well. Okay, but this move queen a5 is kind of interesting because it reminds me of the Cambridge Springs variation. Black is again pinning that knight, and he's eyeing up this bishop over here. And so at this point, after bringing the queen out, it's time to take this knight. Otherwise, he's just going to move it to safety. So I take the knight with my pawn, and then my opponent castles queenside as expected. I castle kingside, and then my opponent plays b4, and then my heart skipped a beat here. I didn't see this move coming. I didn't realize at all until he made it that he could be attacking my bishop and my knight at the same time. But I got very lucky that there exists a saving move in the position. Sometimes you get lucky in chess, and I played it. Knight to e4 saves both pieces. Okay, so play continued with pushing this pawn to c5, which is a typical move in this opening this diagonal for the bishop here, and attacking this pawn on d4. Okay, now I decided after pausing here for a while to play queen c2 with the intent that if he takes my pawn on d5, I'll get the c4 pawn with check, and I'll have a nice open c file to his king to work with. And that's what happened. He takes on d4, I recapture with the queen, and he moves his king over to b8. Now, I could take this pawn here on d4, but I didn't want to step in the path of his rook, and I didn't want to calculate any possible discoveries with this knight moving. So I left my queen there. I moved my f rook over to c1 to put some heavy pieces on that open file. And if black did decide to move his rook over to challenge me on that file, then it would have been safe to take that pawn on d4. No more rook on d8 to bother me. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he plays knight to e5 in the center of the board, attacking my queen. Also releasing his rook to protect his pawn on d4. So I thought quite a while here and realized I've got some options, several places I can move that queen to, but I decided to actually play bishop to f4 to pin the knight so it can't take my queen. I've been meaning to redeploy this bishop to this diagonal anyway. Might as well point it at his king, okay, not facing this pawn on f6. And my opponent responded by pushing his pawn to d3. Not really sure what that's about, but it's well guarded on d3, I suppose. It's not really a threat to queen anytime soon. These squares are all covered. So I ignore that push, and I play knight to g5. And I think in this position I feel really good. I think I'm winning because I'm threatening this pawn on f7, which would fork not only those rooks, but also the knight on e5. After looking at this with the engine afterwards, the engine suggested a stronger move was knight to c5. Okay, I did not see that, but the queen is no longer protecting the knight in this position, so that's a threat on the pinned knight. Okay, it's also threatening various things like opening up the c file here for the heavy pieces. Okay, and I don't think black can save the knight in this position. Oh yeah, I'm also threatening to win that bishop because I've got two pieces facing it. So I'm threatening both the bishop and the knight. So this should win me at least a minor piece. But the engine approves of my move as well. Getting ready to fork here on f7. And my opponent responds by trading bishops. Okay, and then moving the queen to the center of the board, trying to get rid of some of my attacking pieces. Checking and forking here. And I looked carefully at this position and realized I'm winning material. Okay, I can take the queen. He recaptures with the rook, which does protect the knight on e5, but he still has this square on f7 to worry about, so I've got a fork situation there. I take the knight, and then forcing him to recapture, and then I fork. Another way the engine suggested playing was just to play knight takes f7 right away, forking the rook and the knight, which is still pinned. So that would immediately win a piece. I suppose the rook could come here to h5 to protect the knight, but then I'd have g4, and the rook has no safe squares along that rank. So I think that was maybe slightly more accurate. I don't know. Well, here, the engine says I'm at 8.8 now. And after my move, I'm at 8.6, so I'm fine. Okay, so bishop takes e5 check. He recaptures, and then I fork his rook, so he has to lose the exchange in this position. He's down a couple of pawns as well. So he moves his rook to h5, and then we exchange, and I'm up in exchange. I have a powerful pawn. I'm up 2 pawns, so this should be an easy finish. So my next move is an attempt to trade rooks here. When you're up material, good idea to trade, make things simple. You want to contain this pawn and not let that get to you. You want to make sure you don't lose to any silly tricks. He moves his rook over to preserve it. He doesn't want to trade rooks, of course. And I decide to put my other rook in front of his pawn. I could have taken this pawn, I suppose. But my priority was really, my eye was on d3. So I put my rook here, and my plan is just to round the pawn up. Put my rook here and attack it twice and win the pawn. Okay, my opponent pushes his e-pawn forward, so now it's protected laterally there. And I was planning on playing rook e3 in this position. I decided against it because of rook e3, d2, and then rook e2 to attack it for a second time. And then I realized in this position my opponent has bishop to h6 to protect it. And maybe these two pieces can protect it for quite a while, and I didn't want that to happen. Of course, I have this pawn, so I think this is a fine way to play. I probably would have been just fine. There's lots of ways to win this. But instead of that line, I decided to play f4 to block out the bishop from protecting the pawn if it reaches d2. And then my opponent plays bishop d6. Then I attack the pawn. And then he takes here. He can't save the pawn. He can push it forward for a minute, but then there's no way to further protect it. So he takes my pawn on f4. I take on d3. And this is where my opponent finally resigns because he realizes he has to trade a pair of rooks here. He can't move the rook over and lose the bishop. Okay, so I was quite happy with the outcome of that game. Thanks for watching.